In 1980, Robert Nisbet, a conservative sociologist, wrote a book called The History of the Idea of Progress. I was fortunate in having been able to study under Nisbet. He was one of the readers of my doctoral dissertation. As good a teacher as I ever had, fine speaker, good writer, and had the second stage of his career, beginning around 1965, catapult him into national prominence. He had not been famous before then. He was sort of the favorite sociologist of the neoconservative movement, even though he didn't share many of the ideas of the neoconservative movement. But he was a good critic of what had gone wrong, and he was certainly a thoughtful man to study the history of ideas in the West. And in this book on the history of the idea of progress, he traced the growth of Western civilization in terms of the confidence that scholars had and then the general public had about the future. And he traced the whole idea of progress. And that became much more popular after about 1650. Spread of the idea of progress, and it spread in terms of religious terms, Christian terms, and it also spread in terms of humanist terms. Each of them had a kind of a really good idea of progress. It began to fade within the Christian community, although he didn't talk about this, in the late 19th century. And the older strain of postmillennialism, which had been common, much more common, at least in American circles, Puritan Presbyterian circles, began to fade. It had never been extremely strong with Lutheran and Continental Protestantism. But it began to fade in the late 19th century. And also, beginning in the late 19th century, confidence in secular progress began to fade, although it wasn't as open. It accelerated after World War I because of the enormous death toll of that terrible conflict and of the devastation to European culture. And we never recovered from it. Sir Edward Grey made the statement as the war began, the lights are going out all over Europe, and he was not exaggerating. And they did go out. And confidence was lost. Now, the communists had confidence for a time. They were very future-oriented. They did have confidence for a time. They thought power would save. They thought organization would save, that they could transform mankind through the successful application of Marxist and then Leninist principles. That confidence certainly was gone by the mid-1980s. Deng Xiaoping in 1978 announced the freeing up of the agricultural economy of China. It began becoming decentralized in 1979, and growth began. Fastest growth, economic growth of a large country ever recorded. He did it by abandoning the principles of socialism. So you began to see the loss of faith in Marxism and Leninism. And by the mid-1980s, it was pretty clear that it was gone, and within 5 or 6 years, the Soviet Union committed suicide. So they lost faith. That old Marxist confidence in the future was destroyed by events, especially the failure of the Soviet Union in the military field in Afghanistan and the failure of the Soviet planners to make the economy work. So that faith was lost. I think faith began to wane in the United States probably with the Kennedy assassination, and it increased over time. The young student radicals of the 1960s turned into the me-decade hedonists of the 1970s. They got older, they got wiser, they got more in debt, you had a situation in which the optimism that had been common in that counterculture movement faded really rapidly in the 1970s, just disappeared. You had economic growth in the 80s, despite the crises that had been brought upon them by the policies of the 70s. You did have economic growth, and there was some sense by the 90s that there really was a future to the economy. There really was long-term growth possible. You really could retire in comfort. And then that got smashed in the collapse of the dot-com bubble in March of 2000. And then people said, well, we can make it with the value of our homes. And that got smashed in 2007, 2008, 2009. That dream is gone. So where do people put their hope? At the end of his book, Nisbet has an epilogue, and he said, men cannot live with this loss of faith. The loss of faith began among the intellectuals and has spread, and he saw in 1980 that it would spread further into the general population. And he said, you can't sustain a society like ours if you've lost faith in the future. He said, well, where are we going to see a change? And he said, maybe there will be a religious revival. That could change people. But he said he didn't think that out of the entrails of the modern humanist culture that you were going to see a revival of that confidence which had been so common in 1500 or 1600 in the Renaissance and later in the Enlightenment. He said he did not think that could be sustained, that confidence could be sustained without a religious transformation. He said maybe that will be possible. But he said it can't go on the way it's been going. 2 decades later, in 1979, a Jewish scholar named Martin van Creveld, who was an expert in military history, wrote a book called The Rise and Decline of the State. He is one of the great masters of military history, and in this book he applies his knowledge to military issues, but also how the state financed the growth of the military and how the modern state centralized power and centralized legality over a period of 500 years. And he said, it is coming to an end. It's coming to an end. And why? He said, first of all, the state cannot really defend its citizens anymore. And secondly, it's made these enormous promises of old age care, of health and financial support. And he said, there's no way that the modern state can deliver the goods on the promises that the politicians have made. And so he said there's going to be a loss of faith in the state, and people are not going to be able to gain all the benefits they have hoped they would gain from the state. And he said, we're coming to the end. This, not the state in the sense of no more civil government, but he said we're coming to the end of what you would call the Renaissance humanist state. He said it can't continue. 1 year later, another scholar by the name of Jacques Barzun, one of the most respected scholars of modern America, wrote a book called From Dawn to Decadence, which is a history of the last 500 years. And in his concluding chapter, he said almost the same thing that Van Creveld had said. The state has made too many promises. The state can't defend its citizens any longer. The people don't trust the state any longer. It cannot go on as it has gone on. There's going to be a crisis. And he said you're going to see the breakup of large states. You're going to see more and more small states develop. That this monolith of the modern secular state that we've seen will fall apart. Now, Barzun had been writing at that time for almost 70 years. It's amazing. You get in that book and you see him footnoting some article that he wrote in 1935, something like that. I mean, the man had been writing and commenting intelligently on American thought and culture for almost 7 decades when he wrote that book. And that was his assessment. It's a brilliant book. His knowledge of so many things, so many aspects of Western history is just extraordinary. But he said it can't go on. Now, all 3 of these scholars, all 3 of them, had basically picked up an idea from an earlier scholar named Patiram Sorokin, who was the founder of the sociology department at Harvard University. And Sorokin was one of those polymath types who seemed to know everything about everything. It was quite remarkable. And his books are just loaded with references of art and culture and science. Just amazing. Sorokin had the same vision. He said, he called our world the sensate culture. That if you can't touch it, it's not real. If you can't measure it, it's not real. If it's not subject to scientific inquiry, it's not real and relevant. He said that culture is dying. It can't go on. You can't sustain a society based on what he called the sensate culture, meaning materialism. And he was writing this in the 1940s. And step by step, other scholars have come to a similar conclusion. But the big one is, how will the state pay off all of the promises that it's made? How will it not default? And the economists won't tell you. The economists say, you can always save the system. You can always save the system. One more injection of money, one more new injection of federal spending, one more round of borrowing. You can always save the system. Well, you can't. And at some point, the system will have a crisis. That we're seeing the decentralization of communications, and that's going on very rapidly. And that is unstoppable. And that's changing society. This can lead to the decentralization of education. That hasn't happened yet, but it's clear that that's the direction in which it's going, and it won't take much to make that change. You've seen the end of the gatekeepers. Matt Drudge proved it. You can spike all the stories you want. It doesn't matter if it gets on the web. That story is going to spread. There's no way to spike the story once it gets onto the web, except by ridiculing it or hoping it doesn't spread or targeting the individual and saying, well, these people are crackpots. But ultimately, the story will get out. It's just a question of maybe you can keep it from getting to the general public. But if the story is big enough, you can't keep it. It'll be out there within hours with social media. Within hours, a story can spread. So we're seeing a reversal of the humanist dream, and yet at the same time, there's nothing obvious to take its place. What will people believe in if they don't believe in the prevailing education system, if they don't believe in the government, if they don't believe in the message coming to them in the movies? Then what do they believe in? What will they commit to? What will they be willing to commit their lives and their fortunes and their honor to? Because if men will not commit money and time and emotion to a particular goal, then they drift. And you can't base a society on drift. So then the question is, what can we expect? Well, Nisbet talked about some form of religious revival. Now, he wasn't talking about Christianity necessarily, but something, some new religious commitment that people will say, that I can trust, that will bring back confidence in my heart regarding the future. If that doesn't come, then there's going to be drift, and you don't build a society based on drift. You can be entertained, and in some sense we're entertained to death these days. Cheap entertainment of all kinds. Our time is frittered away in this or that project. But how many of the projects do we expect to survive our own death or the death of our children? How many projects do we begin that we think have at least a possibility of surviving 50, 60, maybe 70 years, let alone 100? Very few. And even intellectuals have given up that hope, most of them. So how do you rebuild? Well, it starts, as always, with confession. That is, what do you confess your faith in? And then it goes to money. What will you commit your funds to? And what percentage? And then it goes to media. That is, how are you going to tell your story? How are you going to persuade anybody else that you're right? And if we go back to those three things, in looking to rebuild, in looking, if not to rebuild, to rejuvenate a faltering society, if we look to confession and money and media, we have then what I think of as the three legs of the social stool. You got to sit that stool on something, and it's got to be three legs. And it's commitment, that is confession of faith, it's money, and there's some way of getting out your message. And if any of the three is missing, then you're not really committed. If any of the three is missing in the organizations that you have faith in, that's not going to work. You've got to have all three. Now, historically, the church has had all three. And no other institution in Western history, other than the family, rivals the church in terms of the commitment. Now, the families have it too, but a family does not survive its own demise. The patriarch eventually dies. And 2, 3 generations out, you can't control what your grandkids are going to think or do. And 4 generations out, they will barely remember you. Now, maybe you can do a YouTube final statement, and if you don't make it longer than 8 minutes, maybe your great-great-great-great-grandkid will go back and say, well, that was not too bad, but you have no control over that at all. So the family inherently cannot be sure of transferring its legacy beyond 3 generations. And even that is stretching it, and stretching it pretty hard. So that leaves the church. Unless you want to take over the public school system, but that's a sinking ship. So if you start then with the church, what is the church use? Well, it has preaching. It has a gospel of transforming individual gospel of salvation. It probably doesn't have a gospel of transforming socially the whole world around us. That's not so common, which is the problem. That's been lost. But there's a view that you can transform the family and the local associations around you. That is seen as being possible. Well, that's a Burkean conservative vision. You can do that. Do you commit money? Well, you've got the doctrine of the tithe. So that at least supports the activities of the church. What about media? Well, churches use the media. They're on radio. They're on the web now. They have newsletters that they may not have had 10 or 15 years ago. Churches have the same kinds of opportunities in the world around us that any other organization has. But there is succession, that the church gets the replacement pastor or the replacement elders. The church has a way of stabilizing the inheritance over 3 or 4 generations, which the family doesn't have. Now, it can't come from the state. If people look at it in terms of power and telling other people what to do, if that's your vision of social transformation, then you've moved back to either the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. That's no answer. The state's used to hold off the barbarians to defend the national territory, to prosecute criminals in our midst, to suppress the barbarians, to make it expensive for the barbarians to disrupt our lives. If you expect the state to do more than that, you've moved to the French Revolution. You've moved to a vision of state power in transforming the thought patterns of men that is not conservative. If that's what you think the state's to do, you have abandoned anything resembling conservatism. So it has to be done outside the state. And it has to be done locally initially. And it has to be done in terms of the confession and money and media. And that politics should be an extension of those three things as they have worked in the local community. In the church, in the business, in the private school, in the curriculum, the private curriculum, in those non-state enterprises that don't take the state's money and do not depend upon the state's favor. In those institutions, when they have been transformed, then you're going to see the transformation of the individuals who have been part of those institutions. And then you're going to see political change that will be significant. And it had better be, bottom line, the repeal of the 20th century. You've got to repeal the entire 20th century at the state level because it has gone constantly in the wrong direction. It's got to be rolled back. Reagan wanted to roll back the Soviet Union, and ultimately he did it by bankrupting the Soviet Union. That's how he did it. He made it so expensive that they couldn't compete anymore. That is the strategy, I think, that we're going to have to use with respect to our own domestic Soviet Union. It will bankrupt itself. It has overpromised, and it has overspent, and it has overborrowed. And there is going to be a crisis. And at some point, the checks will bounce. Or if they don't bounce, they won't buy anything. Either the money dies or the government goes belly up. Van Creveld was right in 1999. Barzun was right in the year 2000. The system will not continue. It will shrink. It will break up. What you need to do then is to be in a position on a local basis in terms of contacts personally, in terms of trust that people have in what you say and what you do. You need that. You and others like you need that to make a difference in the local community so that when the breakup takes place, as it will take place at the top, that your local community will not be thrown into turmoil. Because it's got to come from the bottom. The system has got to be saved at the bottom. It cannot be saved at the top. If you can get a representative up there, fine. If somebody wants to go to Congress and use the Congress, as Teddy Roosevelt called the presidency, as a bully pulpit, fine. Ron Paul has used Congress as a bully pulpit better than anybody else in Congress. That has been his strength. He has said what others have wanted to hear, and he said it because he doesn't care if he loses the next election. And now he has people who are savvy about the media to let him say it to a large number of people. And then he's got a great bully pulpit. I can't think of anybody else on Capitol Hill who has a comparable bully pulpit. Teddy Kennedy had one, but then nobody was listening towards the end. So he had the pulpit, but he ran out of parishioners. We are in a position where we can extend the principles of conservatism, the Burkean principles of local self-government, support of local institutions, voluntary institutions, moral framework for society, for social organizations. And out of that will come local political representatives who can then restrict the expansion of the state, to roll it back. And that's a Smithian vision. So you've had the parallel streams in American history all through. The Burkean conservative and the Smithian free market decentralist. And they're consistent with each other. The break came, and it came powerfully, with the belief that the federal government could serve as an agent of healing. And that belief certainly started in the early part of the 20th century. And the next thing that faded, and faded pretty comprehensively, was enormous faith in public education, which meant centralized control over the material and the screening of the teachers. And the next thing that faded was confidence, real centralized confidence in one's own ability to change the world, where the centralization was in what I can do and work for, where I'm responsible. That began to fade, and it was handed over to the state. State's got to save me. State's got to protect me. State's got to put in some kind of a safety net for me and millions of others. And that became a conservative view with the rise and triumph of the neoconservatives. They didn't want to roll back the welfare state of the New Deal. They didn't want to roll back the expansion of America as the policeman of the world. They wanted to extend America's influence as the policeman of the world and the expense thereof. And they didn't want too much of a push in terms of socialized medicine. Thus far and no farther, that was their position. But they drew the line in the sand 60 years too late, or 70 years too late. You should have driven the line in the sand, and we actually know when it was. It was 1904. The line in the sand got drawn by the candidate everybody's forgotten, Alton B. Parker. Parker was a gold standard man, Democrat. And he didn't like the direction in which Teddy Roosevelt was taking the country. And he was overwhelmingly defeated. And because of that, that was when William Jennings Bryan says that's the end of Clevelandism. And Clevelandism was the old American position. Limited government, gold standard, low taxes, low tariffs, free trade, laissez-faire. And the old Clevelandism died in 1904. And anybody in the conservative movement who says we should not go back at least to 1904 is not going to help the restoration of freedom in the country. Now, I know politically it can't be sold, but that's the goal. If we cannot say to take the system back to what it was in 1904, then basically we're saying we have accepted the New Deal, the welfare state, America the policeman, the public school system, centralized control of the media, top-down system, high taxes, massive debt, Federal Reserve System, fiat money. We've accepted the whole package. And people have accepted that package. And they don't have a philosophical commitment to rolling it back to where there was freedom. Rushdoony described it, that very period, as the golden age of America. About that period, about 1904. Here's what he said. He said it was the era before the income taxes and after indoor plumbing. And Nisbet described it thusly. He said, when I was born in 1913, the only federal agency that anybody had any contact with was the post office. That's the world that we have to declare as the goal, the minimal goal, to restore freedom. That takes us back to Burke. That takes us back to Adam Smith. That takes us back to the world before the progressives, before the social gospel, before left-wing Darwinism took over the thought and the mind and the heart of the intellectuals of the country, and then made the attempt to take over everybody else's heart and mind and thought and wallet by means of public education. That's what we need to roll back to. That's the goal. That's the minimal goal. And as the country moves in one direction, as it has to the left, with more and more spending and more promises, and moves in the other direction to resistance to the taxes and resistance to the meddling, we've got to make the case philosophically to say, we went off the track a long time ago. A long time ago. We went off the track in this country. And we have to get back on the track, and we can't do it politically. But when the break comes, and when the money dies, and when the promises turn into dust in the mouths of the people, in other words, when the system goes into default, at that point, we need to be ready at the local level with local organizations, local trustworthy organizations that can begin to fill the gap when the federal government's safety net finally breaks visibly in front of the whole population. That's the goal. And until that's done, we have lots of work ahead of us. And that's why I think you should commit to supporting the organizations that get this message out. That's why you've got to do reading and listening to audios. That's why you've got to press ahead beyond what your neighbors do, because leadership has got to come, must come, from committed people who have a confession, who have the money, and who have the media, the ability to get that message out in a persuasive form. That combination is what's going to make the difference over the next half century. And if you're not willing to commit for the next half century, then I contend that you have lost faith in the future. And if you've lost faith in the future, then not only do you not have any hope, but I don't see how your children or grandchildren will either. You've got to have that confidence in the future that your confession, your money, and your expertise in the media will make a fundamental difference in the world around you. And if you need backup support to enable you to articulate that and extend that idea, then American Vision is certainly the organization, one of the organizations that will supply you with the tools that you need to make the case for freedom that needs to be made.